Hello, everyone. You are watching the live stream of a panel discussion for the first anniversary of the anti-extraditional movement in Hong Kong. The program will start shortly. You are watching the live stream of a panel discussion for the first anniversary of the anti-extraditional movement in Hong Kong. The program will start shortly. Hello, everyone. I am Ken Chen of Northern California Hong Kong Club. On behalf of the 4 organizers and 15 co-sponsors, I would like to welcome you all to our second panel discussion in 2 days to commemorate the first anniversary of the anti-extraditional movement in Hong Kong. The organizers of this event include Hong Kong Forums, Los Angeles, Northern California Hong Kong Club, New York for Hong Kong, and Series for Hong Kong G. Our co-sponsors include Alliance Canada Hong Kong, Canada Hong Kong Link, DC for Hong Kong, Democracy for Hong Kong, UK, Global Solidarity with Hong Kong, Chicago, Hong Kong Committee in Norway, Hong Kong Dossier, Hong Kong Social Action Movements in Boston, Human Rights in China, Nine Walk Cafe, Netherlands for Hong Kong, Texans Supporting Hong Kong, Torontoians Hong Kongers Action Group, Vancouver Hong Kong Political Activists, Vancouver Society in Support of Democratic Movement. Special thanks to Demodisto for cross-posting this live stream from his Facebook page. We are honored to have a distinguished ensemble in our panel. Our moderator is Mr. Alex Chow. The panelists include Ms. Sharon Hong, Dr. Larry Diamonds, Dr. Ching Kwan Lee, and Mr. Samuel Chu. As you all know, Alex was one of the student leaders during the Umbrella Movement in Hong Kong back in 2014. He was the Secretary General of the Hong Kong Federation of Students. Alex, along with Nathan Law and Joshua Wong, was sentenced to 7-month imprisonment in August 2017 over their involvement in the Umbrella Movement. In February 2018, the 3 student leaders and the entire Umbrella Movement were nominated for the 2018 Nobel Peace Prize. Currently, Alex is a PhD student in geography at the University of California, Berkeley. Without further ado, I will pass on the baton to Alex for the rest of the program. Thank you, Alex.
Hi, Ken. I just want to make sure is the visual working on Facebook and YouTube? Because it seems like we could hear the sound, but the visual doesn't come up yet. So is it?
There will be about a couple seconds delay, so they're going to see it. Yeah, you can continue. Yeah, they will see it at the end.
Sure. Yeah, I see it now. Yeah, thanks, Ken. Yeah, thanks for the introduction. And folks, welcome to our panel today, entitled "The First Anniversary of the Anti-Extradition Movement: What Difference Has the Movement Made?" I'm Alex Chow, the moderator of the panel today. The panel has been organized by several groups based in the US, which Ken has introduced earlier. If you're in Hong Kong, today is exactly the first anniversary of the anti-extradition movement. We might all wonder what has changed after a year. What part deserves more attention? Meanwhile, we might ponder, what does the enactment of the national security law tell us? What can we expect from it? Also, how does the changing global economy inform the new relationship between Hong Kong, China, the US, and the world? At this critical juncture, what can Hong Kong people, the Chinese diaspora, Americans, or people from other countries do to help advance the movement? We are delighted to have 4 distinguished panelists whom I will briefly introduce to discuss these questions. Their work might be known to most of our audience because they have been contributing to Hong Kong's democracy movement in different aspects for many years. Our first panelist is Professor C.K. Lee. C.K. is a sociology professor at the University of California, Los Angeles. She is also the Dr. Chongqi Yuan Professor of Social Science and Director of Global China Center at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. C.K. has written many award-winning books about China and the world. Her latest monograph is The Spectre of Global China, Politics, Labor, and Foreign Investment in Africa. Since the beginning of the anti-extradition movement, CK has been documenting and analyzing the development of the movement on the ground, and I'm sure CK could provide us with insights that we might not otherwise be able to access. And our second speaker is Samuel Zhu. Samuel is the founding and managing director for the Hong Kong Democracy Council, HKDC, the group who worked relentlessly to get the Human Rights and Democracy Act passed in the US Congress last year. Samuel is also a nationally recognized organizer for social change and a more democratic world. So besides helping to pass the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, he has worked with the state and federal legislatures to address the problem of American college hunger. So it is really our honor and fortune to have Samuel working on behalf of the Hong Kong people in the US. You might not know that Samuel is also the younger son of the Reverend Zhu Yumeng, one of the three leaders of the Occupy Central movement in Hong Kong. So welcome, Samuel. Our third speaker is Sharon Hong. Sharon is the executive director of Human Rights in China and a professor of law emerita at City University of New York School of Law. Sharon has extensive experience in international NGOs advocacy and has been an advocate for the Hong Kong pro-democracy movement in many international settings. Many of you might still remember how articulate Sharon was when she testified before the US Congress last year. And our fourth speaker is Professor Larry Diamond. He's a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University, and a founding co-editor of the Journal of Democracy. Recently, he published a book entitled Ill Winds, Saving Democracy from Russian Rage, Chinese Ambition, and American Complacency. In recent years, Larry has advocated the idea of using shock power to analyze China. So today, each panelist will be speaking for about 10 to 12 minutes, and we will have about 30 minutes for Q&A section. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat box, either in Facebook or YouTube. Our volunteers and I will collect them and ask our panelists in the Q&A section. So without further ado, let's begin. So, CK, the stage is yours. Thank you.
Okay. Let me try to pull up the slide. I'm not finding, okay, there. Just 1 second. Thank you very much for including me in this conversation. As Alex just said, this is June 9th in Hong Kong, and we all remember, I think, these kind of memorable, iconic pictures from last year, the marches. So my task is to just speak briefly on what has changed. And I want to talk about how the movement itself has changed before talking about what will happen next. I think what we have seen in the past year is that the movement has proliferated into different front lines of struggle, and as a result has created a very broad sense of ownership among the citizens who participate in many, many different ways. It all started, as all of you know, with very brave, committed frontline youths who literally used their bodies to block the bill, the extradition bill, and thereby triggered a huge reservoir of moral and emotional sentiments, and therefore mobilized a large number of people, both locally in Hong Kong, but also internationally, to support the movement. And that creates what I call a cross-class, cross-generation collective actor, which you can say and imagine it to be a political community, all acting together, the vast majority of the people participating. This kind of public support has allowed the movement to evolve from street protest into different efforts of institution building. First of all, we have the district board election, practicing universal suffrage and returning a landslide victory to pro-movement candidates. So we're trying to recapture the political institution. And in the economic domain, there is an attempt, very popular attempt, again, participated by numerous people, to create an alternative to the mainstream economy, the yellow economic circle, which tries to allow competitive, independent businesses to survive, and by people patronizing pro-democracy, pro-movement businesses to turn the market away from dependence on China. They want to create an independent kind of supply chain and also be more socially responsible in the sense of creating upward mobility for local businesses and not just being dominated by red capital or monopoly capital. And then we have the new union movement, which promotes the idea that labor rights are political rights, and people, young unionists, are trying to restructure the power balance, not just in the legislature, but also in ordinary, everyday workplaces. And finally, we have this kind of post-national diplomacy where Hong Kong as a city is trying to bypass the sovereign states to reach out to the world and engages in its own diplomacy and leading to different kinds of legislation protecting Hong Kong people's interest. And so if you add all this up together, I think the movement, what has changed is that the movement has gone beyond the street and to become a kind of embryonic vision of a new, and to many people, a better society. What I like to say also is that the different front lines of the movement, they don't just exist parallel to each other, independent of each other. There has been quite a miraculous kind of dynamic happening among these different front lines, which I would call a kind of dialectical growth among them. That is, failure in one part of the movement can translate into capacity for other front lines. What looks like setbacks are actually advances. So to give you some example, those marches in June that actually failed to block the bill, they failed, but they also gave rise to something very positive. That is, they legitimized more radical forms of protest by youngsters. And the kind of public support for these youngsters have been translated into the district board electoral gain. And that gain has fueled an even bolder attempt now underway to capture the legislature, the 35+ campaign. And because of these electoral gain, the movement, even though it became more violent, it actually has increased legitimacy in the eyes of the international community, because elections, the votes, are actually the most important currency in international legitimacy politics. To give you another example, with those protests becoming more radical and sacrifices, injuries, and arrests increase, of course, due to police violence, that incur sacrifices, real sacrifices on the protesters, but also that fueled lobbying efforts leading to some successes. And because of the sacrifices, movement activists were compelled to find and be innovative to create other forms of struggle beyond the streets. And that's why we have the yellow economy, the unions, and so on and so forth. The national security law looks horrible and is creating a lot of fear, but it actually bankrupts the one country, two systems. And I think the situation now is opening up other political possibilities. And one final remark about this dialectical growth. I think the reason that it happens in this movement, by the way, it didn't happen in the umbrella movement, but it happened in this movement because one of the main reasons is that this movement has managed to garner broad public support. And where did it come from? Where did this broad public support come from? And one important source, and very ironically, and I think dialectically for academics, is that it comes from regime repressions that in the past years has also become more widespread and taking multiple forms: police violence, institutional violence, and what I call symbolic violence, which is the violence created by misrecognizing, misclassifying, misnaming reality. Civil liberty protests now become terrorism, color revolution, and of course, threat to national security. This kind of widespread repression by the regime creates a common enemy for the public. And I think that is behind one of the reasons behind this broad-based public support. So what next? I think the movement may evolve into three different scenarios, and we don't know yet which one is more plausible. First one is that the movement may really crumble. Let's be realistic. The due weight of political suppression and economic depression together would really kill the movement, because it is creating a lot of fear and may create and is creating already a widespread livelihood crisis for the general public. So this is one scenario, possible scenario. A second scenario, which I think is what we are at right now, is that the movement turns to a simmer. With steady bubble, people are waiting, they're preparing for a comeback, but not a full-fledged kind of confrontation with the regime. Recently, we see a lot of signaling by people to make a statement about their defiance, not by really violent clashes with the police, with the regime, but by a kind of continuous, small-scale, but regular and frequent flash mob protests, lunch protests, sing-along protests, street booths, and in some rallies, recent rallies, and making political statements of all kinds. I want to give you a very quick example. Last night, I attended a union meeting where workers told everybody, each other, that they have been forced to take no-pay leave for months. But finally, at the end of the meeting, they voted to endorse the union's proposal to participate in a territory-wide general strike that may come next week. So you can see people are suffering, but they want to make a statement. The third scenario, which we can't discount, is that the movement may explode at some tipping point. And as we speak, I think the Trump administration is experiencing this kind of tipping point explosion of the Black Lives Matter movement. African Americans have suffered for a long time. And under the combined crises of police violence, economic and political and health disparity and dislocation right now under the pandemic, I think the Trump regime may crumble and the movement has exploded. And for us, and I think my fellow panelists will expand on this, is when or if a tipping point may arrive and in what form for and in China. Thank you very much.
Thanks, DK, for your excellent observation of the movement and some of the prediction you made. Like, the time management is very good. So I think we can now move to Samuel. Samuel, the time is yours.
Yeah, so thank you, Alex and Ken, and for all the other panelists that are part of the discussion. I think a couple of things. I think I was invited to share a little bit about what this movement has changed as far as relating to both internally but also externally, but particularly here in the U.S. I would say just right off the bat up front that the first thing that you notice is that when I got on this call, every one of the panelists on this call are part of the HKDC advisory board. And I'm not just saying that to to promote ourselves, but I'm saying that because what the protest movement has been able to do in its resiliency over the past 365 days is to create the environment and the enough momentum to unify not just the public opinion, as CK was talking about in Hong Kong, but the public opinion overseas in such a way where for the very first time ever, there is a unified presence, not just in the US through the work that we're doing with our partners, but in Europe, in other places that you're now seeing a taking root, like what you saw in aftermath of Tiananmen Square, but in this case specifically for the democratizations and human rights in Hong Kong. And I think that in itself has to be looked at as being a huge leap forward. It has not been, it's not new that Hong Kongers, individuals and leaders have come to the US to lobby. I often say that, when Martin Lee and Anson Chan were here in the 80s, they were part of the lobbying for Hong Kong's special status in the joint declaration. Ironically, China, Deng Xiaoping came to advocate for the deal himself. And so it's not new that people come to advocate on behalf of Hong Kong's autonomy and human rights. It was back, a few years back when Joshua Wong and others came that planted the seed really 5 years ago for the Human Rights and Democracy Act, right after the umbrella movement that we're all familiar with. And so all of these little pieces comes together, but it really has been because of the last year, the relentless and courageous act of the protester, the frontliners in Hong Kong, that has given us this window for US Hong Kongers, for overseas Hong Kongers to actually step in and create a permanent unified presence. And I think that is a significant, because now, in light of even the new national security law, this permanent presence in the US and this amplification of Hong Kong's voices is even more important, because now we have to speak in moments and times on things that others in Hong Kong might not be able to speak out directly on. And that, I think, is a significant. And at the end of the day, the fact that we don't have to rely anymore just on, in the past, we have to wait until New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or CNN has Hong Kong on the front page before we can get anybody to return our calls in Congress. Now we have this perpetual, continuous, daily grind of making sure that Hong Kong stays on the agenda of the administrations and the US political narrative. And I think that is a very significant development. Related to that, I think it's also important is that even though when you go to Twitter, it might seem like in the last few weeks that Americans, particularly US lawmakers and Congress and administrations, knows a lot about Hong Kong. But reality is that is actually not true. Yes, in this moment, there might be people who are familiar with the protests and talking about it. The national security law has raised some of those awareness. But the long-term viability of the kind of support that we need for Hong Kong that we've been getting has to be built over time. And just in very simple, layout of examples is that, and prior to, I think, this past year, there might have been maybe 10 or 12 to 15 members of Congress who really had an understanding of the 84 joint declaration of what one country, two system is, of the understanding of how elections are currently conducted in Hong Kong, of how the chief executive are selected, of how even the basic law function, and all those things has exponentially grown over time. And that's important because politicians comes and goes, political parties shifts, election will change the makeup of Congress and who is in the White House. But the permanent political power that we're building, that we've been able to build because of the protest movement of the past year, means that we have now built relationship beyond that 12 to 15. We have had meetings with more than 150 members of Congress. And we'll keep doing those meetings because every election there's changes, there are different people. And so while we're very glad and excited about the support. Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who's been a supporter for Hong Kong for 30 plus years, she's been there from the beginning. And then you have some newer voices of Congress like Senator Josh Hawley and Senator Rick Scott, who and Representative Joaquin Castro, who's on the Foreign Relations Committee. All those are newer, but you have to cultivate those relationships. You have to build up that power over time. And just as CK was describing, the movement in Hong Kong has built up these different layers, this different front line. We're doing the same here in the US. And that's significant because that means that we no longer have to rely on one party. We don't have to rely on one president or administrations. We don't have to rely on one particular news cycle or headline to make sure that the interests and the voices of Hong Kongers are heard. And I think that is, at the end of the day, a significant success and move forward that, again, is only possible because the folks in Hong Kong have stayed there and have endured tremendous persecutions, suppressions, and crackdown, and said that we're not going to give up. And I think that again changes. And one last point I want to make is that what has also changed is that it is no secret that U.S.-China policy, particularly even the global community response to China, has shifted dramatically, even in the last 3 months because of the pandemic and because of other related and unrelated issues. The reality is that those opportunities are constantly available around. We see the trade deal last year. We see the pandemic this past 6 months. We see other forms of, as we move into global recessions, that really align the fight that we're in to other international interests and to U.S. interests. But the only way that we can take advantage of that is to build a political base, not just in Hong Kong, but in actual, wherever you are in the UK, in the EU, and in US, that can be activated, that are organized. And that's different than just having Hong Kongers come and, when there's a protest, to speak to someone in Congress. And I think that building up of the political power in the US, we have close to 20 different grassroots groups around the country in the US in different cities. They are now activating themselves, building relationship long-term, sometimes in very simple and straightforward way. They donated masks to local hospitals, help local emergency personnel to get PPEs for their organizations and operations. But it's also about understanding, building this long-term relationship so that we have a political engagement that are rooted in U.S. interests as well as in the interests of Hong Kong. And at the end of the day, for me, the most important thing that has been highlighted in this past year of advocacy, we've done some really important things around passing the bill in Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act and a number of other bills. We have built so many of these relationships with Congress, is that now there is a focused, permanent, and unified voice by Hong Kongers, led by Hong Kongers, with the faces of Hong Kongers that are walking the halls of Congress, that we're no longer just reliant upon other allies and partners, but that we are now coming out and being clear and vocal. And in a lot of ways, the national security law is going to put at risk not only those in Hong Kong. I commend the courageous participation of many, even here in the US. They too risk themselves and their identity and their freedom and their families' safety by being part of this. But more than ever, this is going to become an important base of operation. This is going to become the essentially the ambassador for Hong Kong outside of Hong Kong.
Thank you, Samuel, for sharing with us your thought about how advocacy work and transnational work has evolved and operated in the US and beyond. If folks are interested in how advocacy work like functioning in the US, I really recommend you guys to go back to watch the video about the conference hosted on Saturday. That was really good one. And Samuel also was like, well, explain how that the whole system work in Cantonese. So that is like a really like a fantastic one. Then now we return to Sharon. It is your showtime, Sharon.
Unmute.
Yeah, I'm silencing myself. No, thank you. Thank you for the organizers for putting this together. And also, I know all of you are also involved in many of the other activities, and the need for us to reflect on the year and to really be able to move forward with a careful reflection on what we've learned, and knowing, naming accurately what was failures were not really failures, and that's extremely important. And I want to thank all the incredible group of support groups that are supporting the movement. So last year, literally on this day, I was getting ready in the morning to get myself down to Central and Tonglawan and to join the marches. So a part of me feels, I've been feeling very sad that I'm not in Hong Kong this month where I usually am. But I am so grateful to be able to be part of this conversation and to be part of the work of those of us who are now outside and to contribute to the movement from outside. So really, thank you for this opportunity. So I thought I would start by, looking at what I think, and I agree with the wonderful reflection and renaming and articulation that CK did, and the positive point by Samuel. So I totally agree with those. And I want to add on that rather than repeat that I just agree with them. And one thing that I think has not changed. So I think the question was put to us is what has changed? But I'm going to start with a comment on what I think has not changed. And I think that there's a tendency from the outside, not by our own community, but by people outside the community, to see it in a superficial, linear way and to say, oh, it's dying down, and because they're not seeing the signs that they're expecting to see, or that they want to see, or that they think they should see. And the part one of this conversation that was in Cantonese first, the wonderful journalist from the stand, she was describing her observations in particular about Victoria Park. And she said while people were gathering, she was watching, and people didn't go right into the park because there was the police ban. And so they were mobbing around and monitoring their cell phones, because everybody was looking for messages on the cell phone. Should we go in now? Should we not? Are the police coming in? Are the riot police? And they were, and that there was a great fluidity of the groups amassing and moving towards the park. And in fact, she felt that there were at least like over 10,000 people amassing towards the park. And despite the ban, despite the threats, despite the passing of the national security law, where everyone would then be recorded, photographed that that they were actually there, thousands of Hong Kongers showed up. And so I think that's one thing that hasn't changed. And the way she put it was, man hei bat gam, that the people's spirit had not diminished in any way. And I think that's number one, really important. And it underscores in so many ways that the slogan for the movement is indeed really still the heart of the movement. And that what's happening in Hong Kong now has been happening all last year. It's the revolution of our time, because it really is, as CK said, a new vision of a better society. And the whole way in which the movement is collectively organized is also really revolutionary. So one thing I want to, the second point I want to say is, what is this besides hanging on to the people's spirit is June 4th, the anniversary, I think, exemplifies what Hong Kong people are and will continue to do. And I think there are at least two aspects of it that's really important. One is they're refusing any restrictions on what they know is a legitimate exercise of their rights. So it doesn't, because they know that their right is not contingent on the police allowing them to peacefully assemble. And that is really important, that they insist on legitimately, peacefully exercising their rights. So when thousands gathered, as Martin Lee once said, we light a candle to end the darkness. And so the second part, I think that's part of the movement that's continued to be what is part of it over the year, is refusing to accept the censorship and the silencing of amnesia of what has happened in the past. And President Tsai Ing-wen, on her June 4th message, said, around the world, there are 365 days, but in China, one of those days is purposely forgotten each year. And then she went on to say something very powerful, and that Taiwan had many days that disappeared, particularly during martial law and the White Terror in Taiwan. And she said, and we recovered them one by one. And that's what's going to happen for China, and it's going to happen in Hong Kong. And I think the second thing is that's what's happening, and what happened all year is this refusal. And the last place inside China that was allowed to hold that memory and refuse impunity for that mass violation, it's Hong Kong. Hong Kong held the line. And that is important because the bigger point about what is going on is that the party state is trying to control the past. They're trying to control history. And by controlling the past, they're controlling the present. And those alternative scenarios that CK mentioned, they're trying to control the future scenarios. So by controlling the whole narrative, that's at the heart. So what has changed though, so that's what I think has really been the core of what's remained still the same, is there are several aspects of what I think is changing. And I think it's been touched a little bit on, but let me highlight them. So it's not a tipping point either within China, mainland, and it's not a tipping point within the global, whole global landscape. But I do think there is a shifting of the tectonic plates, and we need to hear it and recognize it to be able to use it strategically. So for example, I think that all of the bigger, broader global context for what is happening for Hong Kong are all things people have, basically named. The US-China trade war. And I think it's been very important that Hong Kong people have said, we don't want to be a bargaining chip in that. So I think that is a really important message. Yes, it is contributing to the kind of power dynamics, but we're not going to be the bargaining chip. I think that was important. The second thing is COVID-19, obviously. Now with the US over 110,000 deaths, what it's actually highlighting for the whole world, not just the US, is that China, or more accurately, the party state under Xi Jinping's leadership, its control of information and censorship, that kind of authoritarian regime presents a deadly risk to the whole world. And so I think that has really brought the risks and home. So that's a second shift. The third shift is that it hasn't been a new phenomena that Beijing has been encroaching on Hong Kong's promised autonomy. This is not new. It started almost immediately after 1997. They were starting to get ready right away with the 2003 and so forth. So the encroachment's not new. What is new is that when the NPC passed the decision to authorize the NPC Standing Committee to then draft a national security law, that was a wake-up call. And the wake-up call was, oh my goodness, this is a not caring about international obligations, the declaration, not caring about rule of law, not caring about rule of law at the local level, which is the Hong Kong Basic Law, and not even caring about law at the national level, that is the Chinese Constitution. So basically, what the NPC did was violated the basic law, violated its own constitution, because the constitution doesn't allow it to ignore the basic law. And Professor Johannes Chan has made that argument very, very cogently. So these three coming together has really shifted, I think, the willingness of the international community, not only because of the powerful lobbying, because they suddenly realized their own national interests were at risk. And this is, you'll see that the UK is now saying things that, frankly, we haven't heard from the UK government, saying, like, threatening, don't do this. If you pass the law, we will pass BNOs for Hong Kong people. Don't cross the Rubicon. Don't cross the Rubicon. Of course, they failed to recognize that, in fact, China crossed the Rubicon a long time ago. So I think so. Those things are extremely important in the context of this this is like a shifting landscape. Now, what should we pay more attention to? I think we could pay much more technical, close, rigorous, systematic attention to the international standards and the obligations at issue, especially in answer to Beijing's accusation that everyone is foreign interference, that you're interfering with China's sovereignty, you're interfering in Hong Kong, and as Samuel already, referenced, Hong Kong, what is happening in Hong Kong is not an internal affair. And not only because of the declaration being an international enforceable treaty, it's because at the time of the 1984 negotiations, China internationalized it. China wanted the G7 governments to sign on and give their blessing, which indeed they did. All G7 member states signed and said, yes, this is good. And the US government was not a muiyan, not really a matchmaker, but they definitely were there to sort of convince the UK that one country, two system could be a very attractive future down the road way in which to convince Taiwan compatriots to come back to the mainland under this structure. So it was China who wanted it to be internationalized because they thought it would help them down the road. And of course, now they're accusing the UK, a co-signatory to an international treaty, of violating China's internal affairs. So a couple of points on the national security law and what it can tell us, because that was a question Alex posed to us. First, I think it exposes the true face of the party state under Xi Jinping. Most of us who are working in the field, we knew what that true face was. But for various invested national interests, many governments and businesses just went like this, we just weren't looking because it wasn't in their interest to look. And so that's why Xi Jinping and Beijing took what I think is a risky gamble, because they're hoping that the world will once again look the other way and not hold them to account, because there were no serious consequences to China and its imperative of maintaining power. After all, business went back to usual within 2 months after the June 4th military crackdown. After all, after almost more than a year of the reports of millions of ethnic Uyghur Muslims in concentration camps and then dispersed to forced labor camps, after hundreds of Tibetans self-immolated in protest against repression and occupation of Tibet, after all this, business went on as usual. So this is why I think that Beijing thinks, hey, we did all that and nobody stood up. But this time, by denying unilaterally its international obligations, by violating its own constitution and Hong Kong's constitution, and thirdly, by exporting the mainland security approach into Hong Kong, that was a bridge too far for international experts and anyone that's concerned. So I think that we could discuss it, but it's either that Xi Jinping is desperate because he has no other things in his toolbox except repression and threat and securitization and politicization of law, because clearly Hong Kong people can't be controlled the way they think they can. So I think it's either desperate, or he thinks that, and the party thinks that its alternative universe, its kind of anti-fact universe, in the end, that kind of symbolic violence of all of those counter narratives that China's promoting, and it are just basically not based in fact. So I think that's what is happening. Now, you did ask us, but I think because time is short, maybe I'll save, because you asked what else can we do outside. So I don't know, Alex, maybe I'll save the thoughts and suggestions I have on what else, what can we do, unless you want me to do 2 minutes on that. I can throw some things out, but I think I'm taking a lot of the time.
We could still go back to that topic when we come to the Q&A section.
So why don't, so basically, let me just close there by saying that what CK mentioned at symbolic violence, I'd like to frame that as we need to take back the narrative, because the party state narrative is deadly for us, and it's masking the truth, and it's cutting us off at the knees in our capacity to analyze and to bring the facts, and it's also stopping us from even being able to frame the alternative futures, because that narrative is a closed iron box. Yeah. I will end there and maybe jump in later during the discussion about, so what more can we all do?
Sure,
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Sharon, for sharing many insights with us, especially the narrative, the true face of the CCP, and the multiple shifts that we should pay more attention to. Amidst the shift, we will now turn to our fourth panelist, Larry. The stage is yours, Larry. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. And it's really a privilege to be on this panel with my colleagues here, C.K. Lee, Samuel Chu, and Sharon Home. I've learned a lot from you, and I'm deeply moved by what you've had to say and what you've analyzed, by the risks that some of you have taken, and all the people who've engaged in this movement have taken on the streets of Hong Kong. Let me begin by reacting to two things Sharon said. Of course, you know, I need to be transparent. I'm not a China expert. I'm not a Hong Kong expert. I'm a specialist on global democracy who loves Hong Kong and has, you know, just deep affection and admiration for this movement. So from that basis, and as someone who's getting increasingly involved in setting China's global ambitions and China's global sharp powers, I'd like to offer my interpretation of what's motivating Xi Jinping. I think it's arrogance. I think he thinks that he's not going to stand here and be defied and lectured to by a bunch of ungrateful Hong Kong Democrats who don't understand who's boss. And Hong Kong and the PRC is becoming a great power now. It is the world's second superpower. I think it has clear ambitions of becoming certainly the dominant power in the Asia-Pacific region. And I think its aim is to become the dominant power in the world. So I think he and his colleagues in the Politburo and the Central Committee and the National People's Congress, their attitude is, you ungrateful, defiant, Western value-loving people, you know, we're not going to let you dominate over us or have your way over us. And if you don't go quietly into that night, we'll impose our will. I do give him credit, just from a purely analytical view, for one thing that surprised me. I actually thought and wrote in August that I thought PLA troops were going to march into Hong Kong. And when the troops were moving over the border, I actually think it was a ruse. I don't think he intended to send them in. I think it was an act of intimidation. And they settled on a much cleverer strategy, which is to gradually demoralize, demobilize, isolate, and pick off one by one the different elements of the movement and use the incremental pressure of pseudo rule of law of the judicial system there. And if it's not enough, and for them it's not enough now, so this is why they need the national security law and they need the extradition bill so they can try all these people ultimately in the mainland if they need to. And that's actually, you know, not as immediate and crushing a threat as a repeat of June 4th in Tiananmen Square, but it's in some ways no less difficult to resist because its creeping, incremental, suffocating nature can lure others in Hong Kong and internationally, but especially internationally, into a sense of complacency. Well, it's not that bad. They haven't crossed the Rubicon yet. It's just a few people, and then it's just a few more people, and then most of the movement is demobilized and in jail. So I think one of the things we need, as several of you have noted, is very hard, clarifying, globally broadcast and distributed analysis of what's going on here. The People's Republic of China is bidding for global leadership. They are trying to rally people in East and Southeast Asia, people in Latin America and Africa, people in their great, Belt and Road Initiative and their digital Silk Road, all of the instruments of the United Nations and the World Health Organization into the notion that they're the new virtuous power, the new face of a global normative order, that they can be trusted. And what does the reality of Hong Kong show, except it's all a lie? They can't be trusted. They have no respect for not only international law, because after all, the most fundamental law they're violating within the mainland and within Hong Kong is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. But beyond that, they can't even live up to the very explicit commitment that they made in the 1984 Sino-British Joint Declaration. And so, main thing I want to say about reacting is that we have to make them pay heavy prices for what we're doing, what they're doing. We have to raise the costs in a variety of ways to the Chinese Communist Party state leadership of going down this road to suppress the freedom of Hong Kong. And the easiest way to do that is just to let the world know what's happening. And the hypocrisy and brutality and cynicism and duplicity of the Chinese Communist Party elite in having such contempt for all their written legal and moral obligations. And I think we should never underestimate the power of evidence, the power of analysis, the power of persuasion, and the power of global moral engagement here. I'm not saying it's going to necessarily change their behavior, but it is going to give them pause. And I can say this, members of Congress can say this, the Secretary of State and the British Foreign Minister and others can say this, Chris Patton can say this, but the most persuasive people to say this are the four of you and all your colleagues in Hong Kong and in the Hong Kong diaspora, whose city it is and whose jurisdiction it is. I want to say a word about strategy, which CK has, I think, very incisively introduced in analyzing the evolving tactics of the Hong Kong democracy movement, which are so important and I think so hopeful in showing creativity, adaptability, this nimble sense of the possible. But it's very important to continue to evolve and to be unpredictable and to find those spaces for contestation that are that the establishment in Hong Kong and Beijing haven't anticipated, and that can mobilize asymmetric advantages of the Hong Kong democracy movement. I'd like to remind us all of the, two of the core principles of nonviolent civil resistance and of all successful movements for democracy and social justice. You have to unite your ranks and widen your ranks and divide the opposition and narrow its ranks. So I talked a little bit about doing that internationally, but I want to say a word about China itself that is, I know, will not meet with universal acceptance in Hong Kong, and I respect that. I've had these conversations in Hong Kong with Hong Kong democracy activists, and I respect their emotion, I respect their ambition, I respect their moral case. But I think that declared aspirations for separatism are really, really dangerous. And it's not so much because it further motivates the Beijing leadership to try to crush the Hong Kong democracy movement. It's probably not even modestly because of that, because they've got plenty of motive already. The Hong Kong democracy's movement, moving for democracy in Hong Kong, is motivation enough for the Beijing leaders to want to crush them. It's the impact it has on other Chinese in the mainland who maybe aren't crazy about the Chinese Communist Party state, who are developing their own doubts and their own frustrations that we don't even fully understand. I want to say, in response to what's been said about forgetting history, a really fascinating article that my young colleagues at USC, CK, you may know them, Aaron Baggett-Carter and Brett Carter, have published in the New York Times, doing some data analysis of protests that show actually there are spikes in domestic protests within China on June 4th and on other dates. There's been at least somewhat less forgetting than the world generally assumes. And there may be somewhat more resistance and disgust with Chinese communist rule than we realized. And so ultimately, Hong Kong is going to be liberated to become a democracy, and whatever else the people of Hong Kong want it to be, when there's democracy in the mainland. And I'm afraid it's, or some degree of political liberalization in the mainland, and I'm afraid probably not before then. So don't make it more difficult for democratic aspirations in mainland China to triumph. Try and find ways of appealing to and inspiring mainland Chinese. I don't think this is something that many people in the Hong Kong democracy movement have given enough thought to. And then, of course, finally, elections. I think the district council elections are a perfect example of Martin Luther King's phrase, eyes on the prize. And the prize is to grab whatever political power you can within the space that now exists. So I'll just say again, I understand, well, I don't understand because I'm not a Hong Kong expert, but I have some dim awareness of all of the complicated divisions in the political and electoral space that make it hard to unify behind individual candidates in swing districts. But I hope as much as possible that the movement will find ways of unifying to maximize every possible seat they can win in the coming LegCo elections. Let me close with a few bullet points on what can be done. First of all, as I said, international consciousness raising and public diplomacy. We have to do everything we can to make the world aware, the American public aware, and if we can, the people of the People's Republic of China aware of the cynical, duplicitous, authoritarian, immoral behavior of the Chinese leadership. They don't deserve a place of international leadership and the control they're trying to take of UN agencies with this kind of behavior. Second, I think we definitely need to impose, under the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, real costs on the leaders in Beijing and in Hong Kong, including not just the Hong Kong government, but crucial business and financial elites that are complicit in the political authority structure of Hong Kong, who are responsible for this betrayal of Hong Kong's rights under all of these agreements. But we've got to have these sanctions, which should start with targeted sanctions on individual elites, be graduated in nature. Because if you try and do everything at once, there's no more room to impose more when things get worse. And I would lean now for targeted sanctions, visa sanctions, and seizure of overseas assets on some of the worst violators, and make it clear that those targeted sanctions could be imposed on many more people. I'd like to try and avoid hurting the people of Hong Kong with Hong Kong-wide economic sanctions, but I think we need to have a debate on how far trade sanctions should go, and that debate might be guided by the same principle that we used in South Africa in terms of trade sanctions. Let's listen to the people who are struggling on the ground to take a cue for how far they want us to go. Finally, I think there may come a time, maybe there is coming a time, where it will be increasingly difficult to fully and adequately report on and publish on what is happening in Hong Kong from Hong Kong soil. And there's been some very great models that have emerged of enterprising reporting in non-permissive environments from overseas-based digital media outlets. And I think we should, one thing we can do is support those efforts, and overseas-based Hong Kong democracy and media efforts as generously as possible.
Thanks, Larry. Thanks, Larry, for your observation and advice on the CCP, U.S.-China relation, Hong Kong's democracy movement, and the narrative and beyond. So we will circle back to some of the topics touched upon by our panelists. We'll now move to the Q&A section. So from the questions we have collected so far, there are like several themes. We have topics about U.S.-Hong Kong relation, the U.S. election, national security law, social media, and the CCP regime. I think maybe we could start with the U.S.-Hong Kong relation first. I'll try to read out some questions, and our panelists could like respond to one or few of them. We actually have quite a number of questions. So the following set of questions is about the U.S.-Hong Kong relation. So there's one question about how can we build alliance, like politicians aside, how can we build alliance with the American public to counter the infiltration of CCP in every corner of American lives? Another relevant question would be, how can we, those who don't live in Hong Kong, but support Hong Kong, expand the movements to the Western left? And we have another question concerning the Hong Kong-US relation. What are the practical factors we can speak on when we engage Democrat American citizens, especially weighing against what is in the interest of the United States? So I would bring up two more questions. Yep, there's another question about to what extent is supporting Hong Kong democracy a genuine priority of American foreign policy versus a convenient political tool to use against China, given the atmosphere of the moment? And one final relevant question would be, US aside, how should we engage more fruitfully with the rest of the world, especially the UK?
So maybe I'll jump in. So and I would love to hear the answers from others as well. But I think that there are a couple of things that immediately comes to mind. I think there's a lot of, based on one of the questions I think you said, it is really important in lobbying and in advocacy that you understand that it has to do with self-interest, not selfish interest, not just about themselves. Sometimes that is the case, but effective relationship building for Hong Kong has to really be put into the context of U.S., not just collective U.S. interests, but really the political interests of parties and individuals. Now, to say that it's not to dismiss it, I think that the U.S. has a history of being a defender of human rights. It has not always been the case. It ebbs and flows as leadership changes, as the administration changes. But I think that a few of the things that make sense to focus on is that the only way you build political relationship, influence, and power is to engage politically. And I think that that's part of what HTDC sometimes, I think people look at the advocacy for Hong Kong as being sort of advocating just for what is happening in Hong Kong. But really what we're doing is activating, cultivating the same kind of political activism that you're seeing on the streets of Hong Kong. But here in the US, in offices of Congress members, in voting boxes, in community events and forums and one-on-one meetings. And that kind of activation is going to be key, because that is where the free-flowing information that Larry talks about, that Sharon talks about, of how do you make Hong Kong an ongoing priority, is to have the political power in the US and wherever you are to keep it as a priority. And I think that is important. And I think the other that is also worth thinking about is that we have got to continue to invest in political leadership, public leadership development. You have to remember that after Tiananmen Square, much of the pan-democrat movement that came out of there became the political force and leadership for the movement in Hong Kong in the 90s and 2000s. Alex is a great example. I met Alex when he was, I think, 20 or 21 back in 2014. But there is a investment, a pipeline that has to continue to be invested. And that's part of what I think Larry referred to and mentioned at the end is how do we continue to invest financially, economically, culturally, and socially, and personally into the growth of the movement. And that starts from giving not just visa protections, having them come to the States for education and giving them some of that safety protection, but to actually give and build organizations that they can lead going forward. And so I think that those are things, some of the things that are more long-term. But one quick note about it is imperative that Hong Kongers and US Hong Kongers do not get bought and stuck with one political parties or one political candidates. There is no such thing as a savior for Hong Kong in the US or anywhere. And it is our job to be nonpartisan and to be fiercely nonpartisan, to make sure that it is the story, the people, the interests of Hong Kong that we're advocating for, and not just let ourselves be co-opted into a political party or political ideology, because that in itself is going to weaken our ability to fight for Hong Kong in the US for the long run.
Thank you, Samuel. Do others want to respond, Sarah, Sharon?
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to jump in on Samuel's. First on and also on the question, the infiltration of the CCP in America, that question, I think we should see it in the context of the very structural, systematic, comprehensive strategy of the CCP in exerting its influence throughout the world. And that influence impacts on think tanks, on universities, media outlets, buying up all the outlets, and in particular, monitoring, surveillance Chinese nationals abroad, including the overseas students, including people like myself that they consider Waqu, low Waqu, the overseas Chinese. So the context of infiltration is something that I think has been relatively slower from the analytical that I think Larry, that was absolutely right, that we need better research, better analysis. And I think that is slowly getting to be a little bit more of the research on how does the United Front operate? How does it, should it actually have to register as a foreign agent? And that the way it's operating as Confucius Institutes and behind that. And so it's a very, very systematic infiltration. And some of that has been written about as, exploiting the openness in the US, the shop price. All of that has been theorized. And I think not theorized adequately, but I'm saying it's beginning to be theorized in a very constructive, useful way. But I think on that, what can be done is it needs to be more granular, so that depending on the questioner poser, I think that people can think about, if you're in a university, you should be finding out, what kind of endowed chairs are being endowed and the money is being accepted by the university. What kinds of new programs are being set up? Where are the strings being attached? Where is the money really coming from? There was a university that I went to, that I didn't go to, but I attended this exhibition, and it turned out the cultural exhibition had been funded by the authorities in China. So there was a huge part of the historical retrospective that was missing. Like when I got to 1989, suddenly it jumped to 1992 or 93, and I said, hey, I just want to make sure this is a big exhibit. Did I miss a panel? And stuff like that. And then they just gave me a dirty look and said, really? You're asking a serious question. So I think that's how everyone can play a role, because everybody is lodged somewhere. And I think that's where everybody can be more vigilant and also ask the questions, follow the money. Where is the money coming from, and where is all? So I think that's really important. On Samuel, if I can just pick up quickly, self-interest. From a strategic point of view, that's absolutely right. And I think that's a weakness sometimes of the human rights advocates like ourselves, because we think we're talking to people who share our values, and we think that they really care about the human rights values. And so sometimes our advocacy is not as effective because we're talking to ourselves. So I think to be effective in the advocacy to different audiences, you really do have to appeal to the self-interest. But here's my important point about that. Actually, if governments, foreign Western democratic governments, really, really protected their own national interests, they would be protecting Hong Kong, because by protecting Hong Kong's genuine autonomy, the rule of law in Hong Kong, protecting Hong Kong people's advocacy for democratic, they are protecting their own companies doing business with China. They're protecting their own nationals, of which there are hundreds of thousands living in Hong Kong alone. So they're protecting their nationals, they're protecting their company businesses. And finally, they're actually protecting that you can't do business in any way in the diplomatic arena, in the business arena, with a promise breaker. That's not very good, to engage in a trade deal where, a few months later they say, sorry, that was just a policy. Like, we're not gonna do that anymore. You want us to buy the grain? We changed our mind. It's not a very reliable leader. So I think finally on the normative front, by standing up for these international values that most of these Western democracies say they are about, democracy, rule of law, and human rights, by standing with Hong Kong and enabling and supporting that movement, they are being consistent with their own values. Because if you're not consistent with your own values, you're kind of like a hypocrite. So they really need to be consistent. So Samuel, I agree, self-interest, but maybe I'm just going around the circle, but I just feel like protecting Hong Kong's interest is in their self-interest. So I wanted to just add those two quick points.
Can I add two more points to my panelists' comments, Alex?
Sure, please go ahead.
Very briefly, I think on what we can do, I think I agree the strategy, of course, is to promote the cause of Hong Kong, among national governments, halls of power. But another very important target would be civil society, and to build bridges. I mentioned police violence that US and African Americans in particular are suffering. And we share that kind of predicament in Hong Kong. And so we could build on their momentum right now to highlight that they are not the only one. US is not the only country. And the Black Lives Matter movement is not the only one that has suffered from the infliction of this kind of police violence. And I mean, think about the Yellow Vest movement. And I think we can put Hong Kong in the context of a broader global networks of movements, and to find common cause with them, and to put our issue, the Hong Kong issue, in the front page all the time, because we strike a kind of alliance because of the similar problems that we encounter. That's one point. The other point about China's infiltration, I think Sharon is absolutely correct that it has mobilized and it has always activated the United Front machinery, which dated back to the 1930s. And so it's very powerful, it's very elaborate, well-established, well-oiled. But I want to highlight one thing, that for that to work, there has to be local, willing, complicit agents. I mean, to take the money, to be willingly being corruptible. And I think we need to, on the one hand, highlight the agenda from Beijing, but also who are those intermediaries that make United Front work so well, and to do research, maybe to expose those local connections, the corroborative agents, without which that won't work. And we just cannot focus all the power on Beijing and to miss the many layers of collaborators. So a lot of research to be done, but also exposure of what we know through that research. The Confucius Institute is experiencing a serious setback. I think that's an example to show that United Front strategy doesn't always work if we are vigilant, if we muster enough empirical evidence and do our job as faculties and students to push back.
Yeah, I completely agree. These have been great comments. Let me just add what some of you know, that we produced a report in November of 2018, which came out of a book last summer on China's influence in American interests, which tried to raise the flag of consciousness about China's influence activities in the United States and more broadly elsewhere. They're far more advanced in Australia and New Zealand. And I'll just say for us at Hoover, we aren't finished. And we're launching a new phase of work. I won't go into the details here, to drill down further into this. The problem isn't going away, and it's a global problem. The National Endowment for Democracy, as you know, has been releasing a series of reports on authoritarian sharp power projection around the world. My colleague Glenn Tiffert produced one on the compromising of the knowledge economy. And so, and then this tremendous research, that granular research you asked for, that's going on in Australia, where they've really been a kind of canary in the coal mine. I do think this work is very important, because if the PRC and its United Front and propaganda and covert operation machinery succeed in insinuating the PRC into the deep tissues of civil society and politics, and into controlling the narrative in these democratic societies around the world, it isn't going to be good for Hong Kong. It isn't going to be good for freedom anywhere in the world. And I'd like to just say one thing very specifically, which was not one of our recommendations, but which I keep coming back to in my mind. One of the things that the PRC has done is really take control of Chinese language media in many places around the world, including, I am told, I can't evaluate it directly, in the United States and in Australia. And we still don't have a good pushback against that. And look, you can say it only matters for those people in the Chinese American or Sino-Australian community who mainly get their news and information from Chinese language sources, but that's an influential part of the population. And so I actually think the United States should create essentially a Chinese language version of national public broadcasting. And we should have neutral flows of news and information going to Chinese language speakers inside the United States and globally. I just think we need to do a lot more with neutral and fair and unbiased flows of information and analysis in different languages.
Great, thank you. Let's move to the second set of questions. It is about the US election. And a lot of the questions are actually about President Trump if you want to speak to him, you can also comment on that, because many of the questions are about how would the upcoming U.S. election form the dynamics between the U.S. and China in the next 6 months? And from your observation, is the Chinese regime crumbling? Why the Chinese government is taking a full-on aggression in different aspects? And as for the U.S. administration, would Trump's administration collapse? And how would that affect the Hong Kong-U.S. dynamic? And it seems like many Hong Kong supporters support Trump because of his assertive stance on Hong Kong. What do you think about this kind of phenomenon? And how would you advise the Hong Kong protesters? So these are some of the questions generated by our audience.
Let me just say, I think Samuel has given them the best advice they possibly could have gotten, which is don't take sides in American politics, and don't look to one party or one politician as your savior. There's very broad bipartisan support for Hong Kong and for human rights in China and for Taiwan, I might add. And you don't want to lose that. That's precious, and in this day and age, rare in American politics. And I have very strong views about the US election, but I'm not going to articulate and who should win. But I'm not going to articulate them here because I don't want to intertwine this issue of Hong Kong's future and Hong Kong's freedom with partisan politics in the United States. So I'd say, if you like President Trump and you think that he's been supportive of human rights in China, although I'll say he hasn't been very explicit about it. But if you like him, keep in mind that there are a lot of Democrats, starting with Nancy Pelosi in particular, but I also think the Democratic nominee, Joe Biden, who have very strong principled stands here. And if you don't like President Trump, just keep in mind that his top person at the National Security Council and Deputy National Security Advisor, Matt Pottinger, is one of the best people we've ever had in that role on China. And if you don't think so, read or listen to in Chinese the amazing speech he gave on May 4th. So that's the only thing I'll say. It's going to be a very competitive and bitter election. Don't wrap this up with partisan politics. The Hong Kong democracy movement will only weaken itself within the United States if it does so.
And I'll just add to, I think, thank you, Larry, and I think beyond the understanding that, obviously we have to hold to be fearlessly nonpartisan. And another way I would put it is that our candidate, if you support and truly believes in Hong Kong future and want U.S. support, engage in this election in the U.S. with Hong Kong as your candidate. Make sure that both sides respond and answer to the questions that we have, that you have, and your concerns about Hong Kong in a way that is adequate. And that is part of what organizing and I think engaging means. But I think I also want to say that, again, I think that Larry brings out a really good point, is that the federal government is vast. It is important to realize that the relationship that we're building right now, people forget that, there are hundreds of thousands of people who will go into whatever administration, who gets administration jobs, who works in the State Department, who works in the White House, like Matt Pottinger, the relationship are being built right now. This goes back also to the infiltration, is that I think that this is why it's important that we continue to build up our operation in DC, because the Chinese government is funding the policy think tanks. They are funding the internship and the fellowships and the research. And part of what we have to do is to expose, but also to invest ourselves. We got to build up this systemic investment so that we know either if this administration continue or if there's a different administrations, the key people who are staffing these issues at every level of government are people that we have to be in relationship with. And that has to start now, that has to be continuous, that has to be permanent and long-term. And so I think that that's an important move to this.
So I'd like to jump in, and I might offer a slightly different angle on this exchange. And that is, I agree with both Larry and Samuel from the strategic point of view, though we might disagree about whether it's actually strategically bad or good. So I hear what you're both saying as strategically don't take sides because that's going to weaken. But I want to take it from another point of view, which is not about the strategic point of view. And I take it from the point of view of, unfortunately, from my work, which is I'm a human rights lawyer. And what has been happening really for the last 20 years or more, or maybe since World War II ended, is that the whole purpose of the existing human rights system is to prevent what happened from ever happening again. And that is the murder of millions of people. And what we're seeing now, and this is what we have to see the context of America's government and its leadership or failed leadership, is this context. And that is, there is a global resurgence. There is a global resurgence of anti-democratic forces, a global resurgence of racism, homophobia, anti-Semitism, and violence, state-condoned violence, in other words, police violence. So the way I think of the US is not like they're exceptional, China's exceptional, is that it is part of a global trend that is alarming, dangerous, anti-rights, anti-democratic, and anti-rule of law. And it's happening in democratic countries, including the US. And we're seeing it in France, we're seeing it in Germany. So I think we need to keep that perspective. And that means if Hong Kong movement wants to keep its, what I think is a core of a really, truly revolution of our times, this is why it is so important to see that where we can stand is to keep faith with those values of that international world order and what it was supposed to protect. And I think that's one place we can stand. And for the US, you know, it needs to lead by example. You know, it didn't do very well, you know, against terrorists, so-called terrorists, and sending them all down to Guantanamo. So there were many, many of that. And I think part of how we as movement people can have legitimacy is first we acknowledge that. Because I get confronted that a lot, you know, by pro-Beijing or whatever, and they go, look at America. I go, yeah, let's look at America. You know, you're right. There is police violence, and there is all of these violations of inequality. And that's precisely why we need international standards, precisely why we need democracy. And every society doesn't have delivered on those social goods or those rights yet. So I think it kind of brings us all together on that. And I wanted to say something about the building of alliance that Larry was mentioning with mainlanders. And I think that is a really important point. And that the three things I want just quickly is that there are mainlanders forever, not just now, who have paid a very high price for supporting the Hong Kong movement. The 2014 umbrella movement, the anti-extradition, they have supported publicly and paid a price of being detained, disappeared, you know, and prosecuted or threatened or, you know, or worse. So I think that's important. And the fact remains is that Hong Kongers have always supported the Tiananmen mothers and since 1989, and the Jilianwei is precisely because they support it. And you can, if I can do a quick plug, go to our website, hrichina.org. We have a whole June 4th website, and you can see that the Tiananmen mothers were one of the first prototypes of a rights defense group, Weiquan. You know, it was one of the first prototypes, and Hong Kongers always supported them. And I think because they understood that for Hong Kong to have one country, two system, have a possibility to make it is, and that's what Deng Xiaoping thought too, that the mainland system had to become at least more open and tolerant of a system like, you know, a democratic system like Hong Kong. So I think that's important with the thinking about that point that Larry made, and that brings us to the last question that Alex had asked us, but we haven't really touched on, which is Chinese in diaspora. We kind of talked about it a bit, and that is the Chinese diaspora is really diverse. And we need to start think together about how we can engage and address and pull together into a broader, allies of the diaspora. And you can see that we need to address that because the tensions and conflicts are becoming greater. And that's why you see, like in Hong Kong events that Alex might remember, that the one at NYU at the law school, we're getting hundreds of people protesting us, saying we can't have that panel. And they've actually intimidated universities not to have that panel. Like other universities are being intimidated not to have the panel because mainland students who, frankly, to say it quite bluntly, are the main source of some of the tuition money, the foreign students paying a lot of that money. So there's a huge economic pressure on the, particularly the graduate level schools, where they would lose an enormous amount of financial source revenue if the mainland students decided this is too hostile a country to come to. So I think there are a lot of incentives about that, but I do think we need people to people. I really think we need to figure out a way to bridge some of those gaps, because Hong Kong is not going to be able to fight this alone going forward as just the 7.4 million. There's the 1.4 billion across the water, and there's got to be a way to support. And it's not a few. You've got the whole labor movement inside China. You've got labor disputes that involve tens of thousands, up to 100,000 of people. You have people working on the environment on the mainland. You have the feminists working on violence against women. You have the lawyers working on rule of law. So I think there's a huge civil society base of that are struggling, and that I think that really resonates with the struggle of the movement in Hong Kong, and that we really want the same things, and that we need it to happen together. We need a democratic China, mainland China, for Hong Kong to be able to actually not be fighting the authoritarian regime up north. And Larry, I have to just say to you, you're framing it as arrogance on Xi Jinping, that he just thinks it's arrogant, those Hong Kongers. I think we're saying the same thing, except I call it the mindset of an authoritarian dictator. It's exactly the same thing. It's arrogance, but it's also that, it's in his DNA. He can't conceive of people having a different view, and there's nothing in him that can even say, I can hear it. It's like, it's just constitutionally almost impossible for a authoritarian mindset like the Communist Party to look at Hong Kongers and not think we're alien. I really think there's a piece of it, and you can call it arrogance, but I actually think it is arrogant, but it's very typical character flaw in authoritarian mindsets. So I wanted to add that to your very good comment.
Thank you, Sharon. I know we are running out of time because our panelists have only committed to the panel for an hour and a half, and I could not detain them because we could not act like the police. But I would like to ask, try to summarize, ask a final round of questions, and let our speakers to spend 1 or 2 minutes to wrap up or speak to some of the questions. And most of the questions that I'm posing, they're actually about everyday resistance, and they have come up with some proposal and would like our panelists to speak to those proposals or comment on them. So some of our friends have been asking, when you are dealing with an authoritarian government that doesn't play by international laws and rules or any universal values and ethics for that matter, are sanctions, condemnation, or trade wars enough? What else, in your opinion, can individual Hong Kongers do in our limited everyday capacity? And some folks would say, should we appeal to mainland Chinese? Should we cooperate more with Chinese human rights group in the US? And what do you think about the idea of if we burn, you burn with us, the idea of cynicism? And do you think the Chinese regime is really crumbling?
Can I pick up on that? Because I studied China. Well, I don't know whether Xi Jinping and his colleagues are arrogant or not, or more. But what I know is that they're in deep trouble. This is the objective fact. You know, the personality structure is another question. China is in deep trouble. And people in Hong Kong, I know, I'm here, I understand the kind of depression we're in, facing this all-imposing national security law that's coming. And I think when it comes into effect, even this event could become criminalized easily because it's involving foreign agents, and we're talking about ideas that may not be agreeable to the regime. So we are now at a point where we feel the pressure from China. But it is also very important that we see China, the objective condition of China is that the communist regime is in maybe one of the most serious trouble it has ever seen in many, many decades. We all know the economic growth is really the foundation of communist rule, both for really the nationalism. I mean, without the growth, how can you appeal to your own people saying that China is great? And it, of course, delivers the kind of material interests that many people turn many people to supporters of the regime. This piece, this very foundation of communist rule is not guaranteed anymore. And it, as a matter of fact, is in deep, deep uncertainty. And so, and this is only the domestic part. Internationally, I've been studying global China in Africa and other parts of the world. I think there is a serious backlash against that agenda as well. I mean, look at African countries. And so as some of the projects have been failing, they're not recovering the debts, losing the investment, huge time, big time. So I think we are seeing in China the confluence of two sets of potentially really explosive problems, economic growth that would undermine its legitimacy, combined with a global backlash that has been exacerbated, aggravated by the pandemic, the fallout of the pandemic. So if you are Xi Jinping and his colleagues, you are overseeing a kind of a crisis situation. And I don't want to talk about tipping point because I don't know when that will happen. But it's not something you would enjoy seeing, looking from their perspective. And I think the pressure that Beijing has been asserting on Hong Kong somehow reflects that kind of anxiety, arrogance plus anxiety. And so I think this is the time when we are in Hong Kong is in deep trouble because of how Beijing is acting towards us. But Beijing itself is in very serious distress. And I think we shouldn't lose hope because we are in just according to Sharon, and I agree, the whole world is not in good shape. And so we are just one of those societies, and among many, that have to deal with many crises at the same time. And so we are not alone. And out of this, China is in a very troubled spot now, and I think is in many ways weakened. And one mistake they make could trigger off a lot of events, like the policeman who killed George Floyd. And what happened now? So I think we are at a moment when something like that could really happen. We just have to sit tight and prepare ourselves everyday life. Yes, go to the voting booth when there is a referendum on strike, join the unions, patronize, support the yellow economy, vote when there is election, do all this, help our propaganda and overseas, sign up for any campaign that exists, do everything in our power. And when the conditions are right, and it may happen sooner than we imagine. Remind ourselves, when the Soviet Union fell, nobody expected it to fall. It may happen to China.
The CK, the moment when you were saying, and I think I agree with wonderful, absolutely practical, realistic things. The moment that came to mind when you were saying that is that the guard that nameless guard, who then had a name, was guarding the gate at the wall between East Berlin and West Berlin. He opened the gate. And why did he open the gate? Because later on, 2 reasons. The bureaucracy didn't give him clear instructions what to do. The second reason was he said the demand was so overwhelming. Open the gate. That he opened the gate. So I think it's like that's the image that I think is actually what terrifies Beijing, is that the flood and the demand is going to be so great that when that crack opens, the flood will come through. But it will come through because it's the water is already going through the crack, and it's just consistently agreeing to do that. Can I just add that China is in deep trouble, but that was inevitable as well, because it's built into the structure of a one-party authoritarian state. It's just not sustainable. And let me just state for the record, I am not advocating incitement or subversion right now. I'm going to state a fact. I'm going to state a fact, and that it is actually true, and I'll ask CK to back me up, is that I'm not advocating this. I'm simply stating a historical fact that in the modern history of the world, let me take it as post-World War II, that every single authoritarian fascist state did not last longer than roughly 7 decades plus a few years. So authoritarian regimes do have a shelf life, and I'm not advocating any overthrow, and none of the 5 demands say down with Xi Jinping. The 5 demands say Carrie Lam stepped down, until we realize even if she wanted to, she couldn't. But I'm just saying that, that we actually should keep that perspective, but that doesn't mean we wait for it to happen. And I think that's right, that we keep pushing it. But it's not just China's in trouble. I think Xi Jinping is in trouble because he has consolidated and centralized power greater than anyone since Mao. And when you do that, you've made yourself very vulnerable, because you have isolated yourself in a party that had went to a point of shared leadership, consensus, the standing committee, the old guys, coming together. And he changed that. And that's why but he's now got many small and big, if you're going to go for the tigers and the flies, then you've got a lot of tigers and flies enemies everywhere. And so I think he is particularly also vulnerable, and I'm not advocating overthrowing him. I'm just stating a fact that he too is a bit, not quite on stable ground. So I think that anxiety. And maybe my concluding thing would be what Larry said, make the costs higher. And one of the costs that I think I would highlight is, yes, China wants global leadership. China's trying to control all the infrastructure because it's going to help them build out their maritime projection power. Yes, they're doing all of the above and take over the institutions of the world. And yes, they're all offering alternative models of democracy, human rights with Chinese characteristics, development with Chinese characters, and so forth. But there's one thing it really wants as well. And that is to be a world leader. You don't want to be the leader of a banana republic or a dictator. You don't want to be a rogue regime. You want legitimacy. And that's one thing that I think is very costly. And what is coming up is China is going to put in its bid to run again for the Human Rights Council. And everybody always assumes they'll get elected. Why would they get elected? So I think that's very important to deny the legitimacy of that by stating a government that rejects international obligations, rejects its own obligations, rejects rule of law. Is this a suitable government to be sitting on the Human Rights Council? So I think that is one. The second one is Hong Kong's review before the Human Rights Committee is pending. It's coming up, so that the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Hong Kong civil society has done an amazing job of submitting already the preliminary submissions to that review. I think it's really important for everyone, ordinary Hong Kongers, to be following the progress of that, because we want to make sure that the Hong Kong SAR government can, organizes the appropriate consultations. Because when Carrie Lam came back from Beijing this week, or just recently, she said, Beijing has heard the voices of the Hong Kong people because she carried it. No, she did not carry the voices of the Hong Kong people. And I think that's what ordinary Hong Kongers can do. And the last thing I think Hong Kong people can continue, ordinary Hong Kong people, just every single day, is what Hong Kong people do, which is maintain an incredible creativity and sense of humor. What dictators hate is to be laughed at. satire. That's why you can't have Winnie the Pooh. They can't take it because they're actually fragile. They've got a little fragile there. So I think that, like not just Hong Kong cartoonists and artists, and they're doing amazing work out there that I think is actually taking on and delegitimizing and laughing what looks like immovable power, is to say, no, not. You're actually just a dictator. And I think that's really important.
Great.
Well, this has really been amazing. I've just been frantically taking notes here. I'm learning so much and being inspired so much. Let me first echo what C.K. Lee said in a slightly different way. Political scientists and I'd say political risk analysts are really, really good at predicting the past and really bad at predicting the future. And so I was thinking of making the point you made, CK, that we don't know how long the Chinese Communist Party is going to live. And in particular, I agree with Sharon as well. I think she is in a great deal of difficulty. I do want to I don't want to put a damper on our closing. I do want to make the point analytically that this really worries me, because as she becomes in greater difficulty, I think he is in greater danger of taking risks to try to resurrect his failing legitimacy and public support. I worry about this with respect to Hong Kong, but he's playing his hand now on Hong Kong. I worry about it a lot with respect to Taiwan. This is a reason why I so much admire Taiwan's president, Tsai Ing-wen, who I just think has been a model of principle and democratic forthrightness on the one hand, and very judicious and careful selection of words and actions and symbols, and frankly, restraint a little bit of pro-independence hotheads in her party on the other hand. She knows she's in a difficult and potentially dangerous situation. And I think she's acting with principle and self-restraint at the same time. And so I think watching a little bit how she's handled things and trying to strike that combination would, there could be some utility in that as well. I think there's a lot of value in the American civil rights movement and the long arc of its struggle for justice. And what keeps echoing in my mind through this difficult time is that phrase of the Reverend Jesse Jackson, keep hope alive. It's a dark time now. The dark clouds are settling over Hong Kong. We can see which way the Beijing leadership plans to play this, but they face very serious costs and risks if they play it with too heavy a hand. And we have a lot of levers and cards to play to raise those risks. And I agree with what TK said about Africa. I think it's true in Europe as well. A backlash is building. And so let's collectively stick to principles, raise consciousness, raise awareness, and show that this emperor in Beijing wears no clothes.
I will make this very brief because we're way over time here. But I echo everything, in particular, I think what Sharon, I think passionately, and I think I'm so grateful for each one of them for informing and instructing and guiding, I think, a lot of the discussion, but also activism here in the US and globally for what over the past year. But 2 quick points I will end at this. One is I worked on the LGBT civil rights movement here in the US for years, and at one point before, particularly same-sex marriage was legalized here in the U.S., the movement had lost 34 straight state election ballot measures, and I think that there's been a lot of reflection looking back, and something that CK opened with in her presentation is that there is such a thing as losing forward, because at every turn of this movement, as I have witnessed myself, is that we have indoctrinated, trained, baptized people through this democratic process of fighting for their rights. And I think that those movements, those moments of losing forward is the things that lead us to that unexpected moment of the dam breaking. And so I do have optimism in that sense. And the final point I would make is that all of this comes back down to the denial of someone's political rights to determine their own future, to participate in their own self-governance. And it is our job to fight and speak out for that wherever and whenever, however small and however big the context might be. I think that the fight for Hong Kong is about political rights for Hong Kongers to determine their own future, to exercise their own political rights in their self-governance and autonomous government. It is the case of every human rights violations in China, and the same as anywhere else in the world. It is our job as people who support Hong Kong to fight at every turn of those violations and those denials. When someone is deemed as less than or does not given the full rights to participate, when we stand up to fight for that, we're building the movement for Hong Kong, and we're building for movement for democratic China, and we're building the movement for a more global democratic world that we live in. So thank you. So I'm so grateful to be part of this conversation.
Great, thank you. Thank you everyone for being with us here today. Thanks go to the organizers and our distinguished panelists. I hope you've all gained valuable insights from our panelists. I just want to wish everyone stay safe, stay healthy, and stay creative. Until next time, bye everyone. So we will end our panel today.
Thank you, everybody. You were so inspiring. Thank you all.